Good evening, and welcome to the second Derryfield Fireside Chat, Monday evening Fireside Chat. I am Brennan Barnard. I'm the Director of College Counseling, and I guess, truth in advertising, I'm actually not sitting next to my fireside. I have a pellet stove, so it would be really noisy. So I am in my family room. I'm joining you live from my family room. And I would like to welcome our guest tonight, Rick Clark. Rick is the Director of Undergraduate Admission at Georgia Tech and is a thought leader in the field of admission and is super involved in our professional association, past chair of the Government Relations Committee and on the Leadership Council, and also works for the State Department doing work abroad with U.S. embassies around college admission in the U.S. And hosts of other things. If there's something going on in admission, Rick is there. So thanks, Rick, for being with us tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Also not by my fire. It is 74 degrees here, so that would not be wise.
And I forgot to mention, Rick is also the co-author of a exciting new book. A little shameless self-promotion. No, but Rick is is my co-author of The Truth About College Admission, and so we've had a real great time doing that over the last couple of years and doing lots of presentations and meeting with folks. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. Obviously we're using a webinar format for tonight, and the chat room is live, and I will make sure that everyone can ask questions and make comments there. We also have the ability to unmute different participants. If you want to clarify or elaborate on something, we can do that. I'll also say that we are recording this tonight, and we ask that folks not record this on their own, but we're recording it, and we'll make the recording available for folks to see afterwards. And then one final thing is, you've probably heard about the potential for hacking and kind of quote unquote Zoom bombing. It looks like we have all the kind of processes in place to prevent that. But should that happen, we would just shut the meeting down and follow up with you afterwards. So with all that out of the way, I'll just begin by saying we're really excited to have this conversation tonight about college admission in today's age, and especially with the novel coronavirus and everything that's been going on. And definitely want to get your thoughts, Rick, on kind of the climate around that right now. I want to say just to Derryfield families that clearly we're living in an uncertain time. There's no doubt about that. What is certain is that we're here in the College Counseling Office to support you and to and help students aim high and create opportunities and really look to how they can best follow their interests and look to the next step and look beyond Derryfield. So we're here to meet with you, with all students, and explore those opportunities. And so I just want to say that, Rick, let me just kind of turn it over to you for some general thoughts, if you would, about kind of where we are in this current moment.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me, and looking forward to the conversation. I had not heard the term Zoom bombing, but that explains why my boss the other day, I don't know if you know this or not, but if you alter your name on the Zoom and you come into a new call, it stays as whatever you had it previously. So like yours says Derryfield School. If you don't change it back to Brennan Barnard, then next time you go into a call. So my staff, we've been doing themed meetings, and we had all changed our names, and we were dressed up like this. And mine was Steve Rogers because I had a Captain America mask. And then the next day when I went into a meeting with my boss, this now explains why he was very concerned that there was somebody named Steve Rogers, because he thought I thought I was Zoom bombing. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, it is, as you said, I mean, it is an uncertain time. And, you know, it's one of those times right now, I think, across the country. I mean, I'm on a bunch of listservs with colleagues, you know, at public and private universities. We're part of a consortium with a bunch of public flagships around the country, so getting that perspective. But then we also are in a STEM-based group that pulls in people like, you know, the Caltechs and Carnegie Mellons and others of the world. So I'm kind of hearing everybody right now. And I mean, I think the biggest thing is everyone is trying to figure this out, you know, starting with their current students. I mean, how do we transition into an online format and do that in a way that is helpful and meaningful and, you know, still at the level that we had been able to establish beforehand? And, you know, even for a place like Georgia Tech that has some experience in that space, it's still a huge challenge. Outside of all the other stuff you've probably read a lot about in terms of like, are you going to refund kids their prorated housing? And what's that look like in terms of, you know, things like graduation or any of this other stuff? For me and my colleagues, though, the big question is we work under a predictive model. And so while we are concerned about and thinking about, and I know tonight probably we'll talk a lot about juniors and underclassmen, I mean, the primary concern right now is, you know, May 1 is the traditional deposit deadline, and we are a week now into April, and everyone's looking at their model and saying, it can't be worth anything at this point. I mean, are the deposits we have going to hold at all? I mean, my biggest thing today, I was on a call. This is a crazy call to have. We enroll about 350 new international students a year, you know, and if U.S. embassies and consulates don't start issuing visas, we could literally be short 350 for the fall. Now, that translates to, you know, roughly $12 million in lost revenue. So like, do we go today to our wait list for domestic non-residents, in other words, not Georgia, right? So kids from New Hampshire, New Jersey, California, and do we just pull 500 in to try to make up for that? I mean, and we're speculating. So, I mean, I think you're right. People have way more questions than answers, but it's those kind of like dollars and big numbers, and just everything's got tentacles, you know? And so one thing you unturn pulls up a bunch of other questions. Hopefully that's a start to the conversation.
No, that's great. That's great. I'll just, since you mentioned the international students, I'll just go on that for a second. You know, we have a number of international students at Derryfield and seniors who have enrolled in college or, you know, sent their deposits. Any thoughts for them on kind of how to move through the next couple months as they consider maybe going home and, you know, the potential for visas? What are you recommending for folks?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, you know, I do know for a fact there were a lot of enrollment managers, deans and directors, VPs around the country who thought maybe we'll lean a little more heavily to international students in U.S. schools because of visa issuance, you know, matters like I'm describing. However, what we've also heard is a lot of those students have already gone home. And so while they may be sitting on admits, if they're no longer in the country, then the whole issue still, you know, is there. I guess if I'm an international student still in the U.S., then I would, and I'm planning on enrolling in a U.S. university in the fall, and I have some kind of reasonable option to patch it through the summer, I would be trying to do whatever I could to stay here.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is, I think that two things for international students, but you know, some of this applies to all students. One of those is some schools are starting to put out online options even for the summer. And so if you're admitted to a school as an international student and the school is offering some kind of a summer online option, I would not rule that out as a bad choice because A, it will be less expensive. B, if you enroll, even for a term, even for an online term, technically you are then a returning student. And so if you have a visa issue in the fall, you actually are sort of like in a different category from someone who's never actually matriculated. And so I would be asking some questions around that. And then maybe the most important thing, I think for students in general to hear, especially seniors, is I can tell you this. I mean, I've got a million emails in my inbox right now that say this exact same thing from colleges all around the country. And that is they acknowledge and know there are going to be some kids who are wanting to defer a term or maybe a whole year.
That was one of the questions we had in advance, right?
Okay. And I think you're going to find schools being extremely flexible with that. But I would say put down the deposit first. They may not really entertain much of the conversation without a deposit. In theory, sure. But I would say if that's really where you want to go, whether it be this fall or next spring or the following summer or any other term, go ahead and put that money down, because by doing that, they're a lot more invested in having real conversations with you about how and when do we get you here. Of course, we want you when we said, but if that all falls apart, let's work to get you here at some point.
And what's your process, for example, at Tech? I mean, if a student wants to defer, do they just reach out to you and ask for that? I mean, every school kind of has different policies, but.
You're right. Yeah. Every school has different policies. I've noticed in recent years, especially as a lot more schools are using Slate, which is like I know you know this, but for people listening, Slate is a CRM, a customer relationship management system. It's a platform on which a lot of this stuff is built. I've noticed a lot more schools now, and Tech is one of them, that has like a form that a student fills out and it gets reviewed. And I mean, the first thing is you can't even see that form in your portal until you put down a deposit.
Gotcha. That's helpful. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
And so I'll invite folks listening to use the chat function to send questions to us, and we'll kind of start to take those. But I want to kind of take one more question for current seniors that families had, and that was kind of what about the impact on financial aid and on merit packages and all that kind of things for students who are considering right now, and kind of ability to negotiate aid and all that?
Yeah. Man, it's a great question. I mean, this is again where, I think a lot of schools knew that they were going to have very questionable yield. So yield being the percentage of students that you offer admission to who say yes to your offer, right? So let's just say you have a 40% yield, which is a pretty common one around the country. For every 10 offers, 4 say yes to that. So if in this type of a situation where you've got economic issues, visa questions, melt, which is the kids that have deposited and then don't show up, if you're presuming that that's also going to go up, which I think a lot of schools are, right. You're extending yourself pretty far with your financial aid packages already. This is another thing a lot of my colleagues are saying, which is, I don't think they're all going to show up, but if they do, we are in big trouble because we put a ton of money on the table already. What I would tell a family is, it's important to know that some schools may be pretty extended already, but if you have a financial aid package, if you're sitting on a financial aid package and your economic financial family situation has changed, of course you should go back to that school and say, let me show you now, tax information. Let me show you now income information, and would you reconsider this? Of course you should advocate, and I know you probably at Derryfield have your own process and counsel people in a certain way, but I think it's reasonable to inform and counsel families towards having that conversation in an appropriate way, but also having expectations that it may not, come to fruition. It's going to vary by school, though. And I guess the other thing is that can really change this year, especially. I mean, it would not shock me if schools are recalibrating things even into May and June, which is not, it's not a traditional timeline this year. I think you might see some wonky stuff happening in these next couple of months.
Well, things are just kind of wonky in general, aren't they?
Yeah.
And again, if folks have questions, feel free to shoot them on the chat, and we can address specific questions as they come in. Looking forward to next year, a lot of the questions that people had in advance were around testing, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
There are a lot of moving parts, and every day standardized testing, different things happen there. I mean, even just today, Amherst College and Williams College, both two highly selective small liberal arts colleges, both went test optional for next fall, just for the year for now.
Yeah.
And bunch of other schools, BU and the whole state of Oregon, and I mean Tufts, I mean, you name it, are either adopting test optional policies or are just doing it for a year, or test 3 years. Any sense on one of the specific questions was, what about schools that like tech and things like that, who have engineering programs that typically rely more heavily on tests? Any thoughts on testing in general? Or
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. First of all, you're right. I mean, obviously, there's been a trend and an acceleration of the trend towards test score optional. So that's going to continue. And it'll particularly continue if the College Board and the ACT can't uphold the administration's, that they, I mean, if we start seeing cancellations for like, what's the later, kind of like the earliest fall or the latest summer, I can't remember,
like August and
yeah,
August SAT and
like an August, I mean, an August administration cancellation, that's going to tip a ton of dominoes, for sure. So right now, I think you got some schools waiting to see if they're going to be able to kind of uphold that. But if that one goes, I mean, all these schools with, EDEA that's coming in October and November 1st,
right.
I mean, if you do continue to say you're going to require tests, there's no way you're looking at them the same way. Kids are going to have fewer opportunities to test, period. And less important, I think, junior spring, because of what it's become, in terms of just preparation, in some ways, and exposure to material. I mean, I don't think that's as preeminent as the other, but I would say that here's what you have. Private schools, of course, I mean, that's localized control. They can make their own decisions. And that's why largely those are the ones that are nimble and flexible enough right now to say, we're going to do a 1-year pilot. I mean, why wouldn't Amherst do that, right? Whereas if the institutional control lies at a system level, then they're going to be a lot slower, unless the conversation was already going on in a very real way, which it was in Oregon and it was in California. We know that for a fact.
Right.
But in other states, when you're talking about a system, they're going to be slower to move the needle on that, because they're trying to, even though it's not always realistic, make a uniform decision for all of their schools, regardless of how variant they may be in their mission and their reach. I mean, Georgia Tech is a great example of this, versus the Georgia Southern, that's also a system school. But where does the control lie? If it lies at the system level, it'll take longer. However, that said, the system of Georgia went test score optional for schools that haven't already had a deadline. So like, University of Georgia and Georgia Tech have already released decisions. We made decisions with using tests, but for the rest of them, they've already said for matriculants to this coming fall, tests are not required. So it would not shock me to see more of that happening soon.
And so a related question that folks have, and then we'll get some of these questions on the chat. Related question is, so no tests, maybe, right? No test scores, kind of grades in kind of flux given this spring and everything.
Yeah.
What are colleges and universities making decisions on, and
yeah.
how can families respond to that accordingly?
So, I will say, not that we're sitting here to plug the book, but I looked back at it recently, at the chapter that we talk a lot about, academics and then extracurriculars. And what I've been kind of telling people lately is, to me, this is just a litmus test for how holistic are you really. And here's the thing, when schools sit down to make admission decisions in committee, the very first question they ask is, where does this student go to school? That's how you read, it's how you review, it's the filter through which you look at almost everything, right? So at Derryfield, there are certain classes offered. You can pick your way through Derryfield in lots of different manners. The courses that are available to you, the rigor of those courses, whether you're going to lean more maybe towards the humanities or more towards STEM. I mean, you'll be a senior with the same GPA or the same SAT, but your Derryfield experience was very different on an academic standpoint, right?
Right.
I think that schools are going to do this. One, they're going to push heavily into, where does the student go to school? Have we had students from that school in the past? How have they done? What did their academic background look like? Now, the nice thing about Slate, which again we referenced earlier, is you can directly see that. You can pull up kids from prior years like that. This is something all schools didn't have a couple of years ago. And so, I mean, this is the way I look at it is, okay, I have a Derryfield applicant. Now here's a kid that had a coronavirus junior spring, right. But their progression through Derryfield was very similar. Their course choice is very similar, except for that one semester where maybe I have pass-fail grades or no grades or who knows what, emojis, I don't know. I can see how that other student is now doing on my campus. Okay, sure. Maybe I'm not looking at test scores this year. However, Derryfield prepares students well. This kid took a rigorous course load. What you might see happen, and I would not doubt this at all, is schools either requiring or strongly recommending midterm senior year grades, right? So here's a kid who's in pre-calc as a junior. They're taking BC calc or whatever your kind of, let's say one of your higher level math classes as a senior. They're applying for engineering. Let me just see how they're doing midterm. And I'm just applying everything else I know, plus that. And I have a lot of confidence that kid's going to be just fine.
Right. And in a lot of ways, this is like any other year. And students who are younger, that coming from a school like Derryfield, they're known, and it's a known quantity, and they know how strong the rigor is and things like that. So.
Yeah, and I think too, it's like, I don't know, there's got to be a good analogy, but I mean, you're removing one of the legs of the stool potentially with testing. I don't really think the academic piece is that big of a deal, because again, you've got, solid kid, good courses, doing well, got the midterm of the senior year. I'm not really worried about that junior spring grade. I think we're okay there. But I do think it points people to lean on those other pegs of the stool. So your recommendation letter, teacher recommendation letters, extracurricular involvement. Of course, this semester being a wash, but
yeah,
frankly, it's a wash for everyone around the world. So
right.
Still equal.
And what are ways that students, I mean, as they think of kind of extracurricular involvement in this spring and just, all of a sudden they have this time at home, right? And obviously they're deep into schoolwork now, but what are things they can do? Any thoughts on things they can do that might make them stand out or develop interest, things like that?
Well, here's one thing. I mean, we were just talking about this today in our leadership meeting earlier. Kids are going to write about coronavirus next year. I mean, how could you not, right?
Yes.
How could you not? So I think what we're deciding to do, because right now we're trying to, we're building our application. The window for Common App to build your application is now.
Oh, yeah.
Because it goes live August 1st.
Right.
And so we're, you have control over only certain things, but one of those is supplemental questions. And so my thought on that is, they want to write about it, of course. I mean, they're going to write about it. Let's try to ask the question in a way that we want to read about it, because they're going to write about it.
Right.
And so we were saying, like, okay, how did you use that time? That's what I want to know. I mean, and so that's what I would be thinking of, if I'm a family right now. And so it doesn't mean you have to go find some like Stanford MOOC to take or something like that. But like, again, I mean, you and I talk about this a lot. Like, what are you legitimately interested in? And in some ways, this is the like perfect case study for that.
Right.
And
and finding creative ways to explore that. Right.
Exactly.
From where you are and reaching out to your networks and pursuing it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Totally.
Yeah. Thanks. So speaking of seniors, we have a couple students every year who transfer in senior year to Derryfield for a variety of reasons. And one of the questions here in the chat is, how do colleges view that? Does that affect the student in any way? When they transfer in senior year? Our experience, it hasn't at all. I mean, those students still thrive, and especially in a small school, this transition is pretty seamless.
Yeah. No, I mean, and we know you're going to get to know them and write recs, and the teachers will be able to write recs. I mean, it doesn't impact them at all. The only thing will be different is, of course, schools are going to want transcripts from any school they attended during that time. But we ran some numbers on this. I mean, this is just one school's example, but a lot of times kids feel like, oh man, my mom and dad moved, or I just, maybe within your own city, like you decided to go to Derryfield from a public, or who knows. But a lot of times kids feel like I'm the only one that had this like weird interruption or something. I think last year we ran this number and it was like, it wasn't quite a third, but I feel like it was like 27% or something of our incoming first-year students had been to more than one high school.
Wow.
So, and I mean, I can't say we're, the rule on that, but I don't think we're the anomaly either. So.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
What about demonstrated interest? So we've talked a lot about kind of, and we talk with our families about, going to college campuses and really engaging with the college. Some schools in the past have tracked that interest and the number of times you contact the school, and do you visit, do you show up at college fairs? Obviously, a lot of that's like totally off the table. And
Yeah.
some colleges are still saying, these are the ways we want you to demonstrate interest. We want you to do our online programs. We want you to do a virtual interview. We want you to do those things. But, students aren't visiting campuses. Any thought on that whole idea of demonstrated interest and how it's playing out?
Well,
Sorry.
So I think one thing you hit on is very true, which is, and I'm pleased to say this of my colleagues around the country. I mean, typically they are very candid about that being the fact. That hey, we look at demonstrated interest. I mean, I think I was with you up in New Hampshire when one of your kids got deferred from Tulane or something like that, and they just straight up said that.
Right.
And so
Not this year.
Not this year, no. But like, like maybe 2 years ago or something. But I mean, like, my point is, a lot of the schools that do it are usually pretty, as you were just referencing, pretty clear about the fact that they do that, right? And here's what we expect, and here's why. That's the good thing about having relationships with them. But then again, I was just talking to a friend of mine, at a independent school somewhere else in the country, and he was like, this is one of our top students, and she got waitlisted at a bunch of places, and now we're finding out that they thought she was too good for them, and hadn't shown as much demonstrated interest, and therefore they waitlisted her. So I guess what I would say is, and I know you counsel this way too, you're going to know in a lot of cases if a school uses demonstrated interest, but the school, I mean, the student on their small list of schools, they don't need to worry about all 4,000 schools. They just need to worry about those 7 schools and just ask the question straight up. Do you look at it? How can I show my interest?
Right. Well, and truth be told, because of this and because all these tours and campus visits are canceled, colleges are really building out opportunities to experience their campus and get to know their school. Yeah. And so, I was talking to a parent today, and this idea that every afternoon students could go visit a college, right? They couldn't do that before, and they can do it in a meaningful way and really get a lot of information about it. So, so yeah, there's options there.
You're right. I mean, real quick, I'll just say, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on right now. And there's people dying, and it is very real. And there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety. But I will say, in this little small corner of the world, what you just described is one of the best things to come out of this for us. Like, it is forcing colleges to put good content out there in a way that we should have been doing for a long time. And it's taken a crisis to force us to do that.
Yeah. Wait, so if you had a high school junior, I know your kids are a lot younger, right? But if you had a high school junior, what would you be telling them to do right now?
That's a good question. I mean, first of all, I would say this is a real opportunity for families to do a lot of what we talk about and have the conversations we kind of hope that they would, because they're not running around to tennis practice or, doing a million things. Parents aren't traveling. I mean, they have an opportunity right now, I think, as a junior, which is great, before this thing really gets real, before an application is ever submitted, to ask the big question, and to be really open and honest and listen to one another about hopes and dreams and, why you're interested in that place and why I hope you might apply to this place. So I think more than anything, what I'm hopeful for families is that they will make time to have those type of great conversations. I mean, we were just talking to some neighbors on a walk. My wife and I were talking to some, neighbors on a walk. Like, this is an opportunity to consider, like, who do I want to be when I re-enter the world? Mm-hmm. And I think for families, it's an opportunity to hit the pause button and say, are we as a family kind of heading the direction we want to go? And if not, like, we have the opportunity now to reassess that, and to move forward together. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, outside of that, which I think is the most important thing, I guess what I would just be saying is what you just referenced, and that is, hey, let's look and see what these schools are doing right now. I mean, your job, I think, as a junior in the spring is to keep an open mind. And to start to explore in these low-cost probes some of the places that have caught your eye or that you've helped them to start to build in terms of a list. And sure, it's not the same. You're not physically on that campus, but to your point, you can actually keep an even more open mind because you can actually investigate, I'd say, more schools in this format.
Great, thanks. And yeah, I mean, I'll just hit on what you were saying about kind of families. And again, we talk a lot about this in the book, but having those honest conversations, especially now about finances on the front end, and what a family can afford and what they're willing to pay and how that's going to work. And but also having lots of conversations about college, but not too many.
Yeah.
Like when everybody's stuck in the house, it can turn into almost every other conversation is about college, right? So I would say that families should kind of carve out one night a week that they talk college, and then, or, you decide and you build the parameters as a family, but then just kind of limit it to that. So it doesn't get overbearing.
Yeah.
And since we're on finances too, one of the questions in there was kind of how do families, I mean, so there's been a lot out in the press about schools potentially closing and, colleges closing and, what this is going to do them financially. Any sense on like how parents and how kids can assess the stability of a college, and as they're looking, like, is this a school that's going to be here next year or in 3 years?
Yep. So a couple thoughts. I mean, one is I'm trying to remember the guy's name, David. I can't remember his last name. He wrote the college stress test, which Johns Hopkins actually published. But it's basically like he breaks down sort of like the data to consider on the health of a college. So I believe it's called the college stress test. And I just saw an interview with him the other day where obviously they are recalculating, sort of like your GPS, recalculating now given a severe stress to the system. So I would say that is worth checking out. At least read some of those articles that he's been interviewed in that kind of point you to some of that data. And then the other thing, and actually this goes back to your former question as well, about what would I be telling a son or daughter that's a junior, is use your network. So these Derryfield kids that are home right now from college, maybe at some of the colleges that your son or daughter is interested in, like, they're available, man. I mean, they're around and they're not doing a whole lot. So, I mean, if let's say you're looking at Haverford, like that might be one school you're interested in. A Derryfield kid who's a couple years older, and I hate that kids, juniors, sometimes feel like, oh, that kid was so cool, and they're 3 years older, and I'm not willing to like reach out. Like, they love talking about their college.
Totally, especially now that they're not there, right?
Exactly. And so I know that's not the economics of health, but you know how students are. I mean, you're going to learn something from those, and for the parents too, you're going to learn something from those kind of very real conversations with a family going through that college experience. Not only about fit, but also I think about, because they're the ones getting the email now from the institution. They're hearing all kinds of stuff. And so I would say that's another one that's worth it.
Right. And I think it's tough because, I mean, you do have some of the most well-endowed schools in the country sending out emails to families, current families, saying that they're freezing hiring and budget cuts and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to make sense of things. And a lot of that's going to be kind of a wait and see. But thanks. Another question we had was about, you're going to love this because you and I have kind of bantered back and forth on this, but early action and early decision. Do you think because of kind of testing potentially being delayed until the fall, do you think early action or early decision will disappear or be pushed back? I mean, I know you guys have an October 15th early deadline, early action deadline. And just for families who don't know, early action is non-binding. You apply early and find out if you've been accepted. Early decision is binding, so they would apply and to one school early decision. But any sense on whether or not? I mean, I know you guys have kind of an early deadline, especially because the schools down there, the high schools, go back to school in August, and so it's a little different timeline. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's funny because I've actually heard some schools having the reverse conversation of they may move deadlines up. Back to a little bit of what you talked about along the lines of health and locking more students in. So, like, in other words, let's just say
health of the institution, not the student, right?
Health of the institution. Right. Absolutely. Like, yeah, back to the financial conversation. Right. Like, if we can, maybe we didn't have an early decision program before, maybe we will consider that. Or maybe we add an early decision with as you know, there's such a proliferation here. I mean, all kinds of dates. We could move that up a little bit, lock in even more of our class if the question, because as you know, I mean, we're talking about bond ratings. When you talk about like the real health of an institution, I mean, your ability to generate, loans and liquidity and I mean, yield even impacts bond ratings. And so if you can demonstrate that you're getting like X number of early decision applicants or deposits, especially do that earlier, if you were in any type of a financial pickle, it's maybe a case for your financial health.
Locking in the class early.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know, man. I don't know about you, but like last week feels like a year ago. So what's going to happen in October is so hard to predict.
Yeah.
But, I wouldn't be surprised if you see some like non-conventional things, like for instance, what Wake Forest does, where they have that sort of weird rolling.
It started at the beginning of August, and you can apply early decision straight through until November.
I mean, I would not doubt you see that model maybe a little bit more.
Interesting. Thanks. Let's see some other questions. Just back to the standardized testing. What about subject tests? Can you talk about the role of them? And I mean, I think if anything, students are not going to have subject tests, right? I mean, even if they're able to take standardized tests in the fall, they're not going to have had multiple test administrations to be able to take tests.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and you've already seen like, some of the, who was it recently that went away?
MIT took away their requirement for subject tests.
And maybe I don't know, I feel like somebody in California also, maybe Caltech. Anyway, I could be wrong about that. But yes, you've seen some shifting already because they know that's true. I think so with subject tests, I'd say I can't imagine schools, having that kind of a requirement. It's just not logistically possible. Right. The other thing is like AP tests. I mean, with the way those are going to be abbreviated both in the actual time frame as well as the content that they're capturing and covering. I mean, if you're a school that had leaned on those before to make decisions, even in a holistic type of process, I think those are going to mean a lot less.
Right. Which is fortunate because we moved away from them this year anyway.
There you go.
And there's lots of questions about how those are being looked at and everything like that. So we're happy to have moved beyond that and into a different curriculum. Let's see, other questions. Any other questions that people want to send in? How about any thoughts for younger students? I mean, I think we have some parents who, we have tons of parents of juniors and seniors on, but also some parents of younger students are just wondering kind of how to, I mean, not necessarily around the current situation around COVID, but, what should their kids be doing? I mean, in some ways, if schools are going to be using standardized tests in the future, which some still will, right? This is a great time for sophomores, for example, to be doing some test prep on their own. I mean, they have the time at home. There's a bunch of online courses and things like that. So be getting ready for the PSAT next fall. Other things that younger families, younger students can be doing?
I mean, I'd say, what I want to say is just like, man, just be a good kid. I mean, just like enjoy time with your family right now. And I mean, with the classes that Derryfield's teaching, like do well in those. And hopefully it's not so, imposing on your day that you actually have a little bit more gas in the tank to go do what we were just describing earlier of like, whatever you're curious about, like actually pursue that.
Rediscover something you did when you were younger that you loved and haven't been able to do, and maybe I mean,
I really love this question of what did you do with that time, because I think all of it, anybody on this call tonight could say when we were hearing don't go into work and you're not going to have to be driving your kids around to stuff, like everybody in their mind said, well, this is the book I'm going to read that I haven't been in. This is the project that I'm going to do, or this is the thing I'm going to binge on, Netflix. Like
right. I'll be playing the ukulele by the end of this, just so you know.
All right, good.
Yep.
That sounds awesome. So, I mean, I think that's what I would tell a sophomore or a freshman is, man, just do well in your class, because that's kind of all that's really being asked of you right now. And otherwise, like, think about, yeah, what are those things that just actually bring you joy and that you're just interested in, and pursue that.
Yeah. And they can also, look around at some of the college tours and things like that and see what's out there.
Yeah.
I heard somebody suggested to me that this idea of, for students, especially juniors who are kind of considering their college search and what to think next, but what do they miss most about being at Derryfield right now? Like, what do they miss most about school? And really kind of tap into that and use that to inform what you are going to, like, what you're looking for in a college.
Yeah.
It tells you a lot, right?
That's a great point.
Let me see. Okay, so this is from a parent of a sophomore. Is a higher grade, you get this a lot, is a higher grade in a advanced course. We have advanced topics courses that have taken the place of where APs were. So our kind of our top level course. So is a higher grade in an AT course, a higher grade in a regular course looked at more favorably than maybe a lower grade in a more advanced course?
Yeah, my answer on that one is always, it depends on where you're looking to go to college, right? I mean, the truth is that, a highly selective school is going to expect you to take the most rigorous courses, somewhat contingent upon your major, and do well in those courses, however that is defined at Derryfield, right? Now, the caveat on that would be, a kid takes, a kid is, we'll just pick on Georgia Tech as an example. You want to be an aerospace engineer, we're going to expect you to take those advanced topics classes in math and science and do really well in them. Now, you pushed yourself and stretched yourself, took an advanced topics class in a history and you made a B, not too worried about that, right? But you're pushing and stretching yourself at Derryfield, no disrespect, but you're taking advanced topics at Derryfield and making like low B's, and you're coming to Georgia Tech for aerospace engineering. That's not going to work. It's Georgia Tech, man. I mean, that's just the truth. And so that's the way a committee thinks is, This is a kid at a high school who's taking these classes. I'm sure it's a great high school, and I'm sure that's a hard class, and that professor's really great and all, but this is like Georgia Tech, man.
So one question back to the deferral issue. They're wondering if the potential increase in deferrals this year is going to impact juniors next year.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I would not want to say 100% no. I mean, I don't know, and I hate to say this, but I do think it really depends. I think it will vary definitely from school to school, and this is a conversation that is absolutely happening right now. I guarantee you, at every college in the country, is how liberal should we be with our deferment policy? Because if we let too many kids move, then A, we lose that revenue in the short term, and B, we could be giving up seats for that following year, and that has downstream, implications and repercussions. So I would say, I mean, this might seem obvious, but at schools that have the larger the larger the first year class size, I would think the larger the flexibility, because, you know, at a place like Georgia Tech, our first year class can be 3,300. Like, what's 50? Well, 50 is a big deal at Harvard because they got what, 1,600 in the class. Like, that percentage
Right.
is a much bigger deal. And so I would say if it's a smaller school, they're going to probably have to be a little more stringent upon their deferral policy than at the larger schools. It's a great question, though, and it's not something I have a firm answer to, because those are actual conversations happening right now.
Right. Yep. There's a lot unknown. Since you've been super generous with your time, and we really appreciate it. Any kind of final thoughts for folks, either from the book or just from your experience now, or just kind of great Rick Clark wisdom? I mean, what I didn't mention at the beginning is you have a great blog on the Georgia Tech website that people should definitely go in and follow, because it's just your use of humor and your kind of balanced voice is really appreciated.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah. Any final?
And last week's blog, I mean, you know, first of all, just to say one thing about that, we do not write about Georgia Tech. It's not about us. In fact, I have like 3 things written on my board at work, and one of them is bigger than us. So, you know, we always try to just tell a bigger story. And so last week's blog was great for juniors. I didn't write it. It was a woman in our office named Katie Matley. You could go onto the blog and find it and read it. I highly recommend it. It is phenomenal for juniors and parents of juniors to read. I think it's called Being Seen. And she talks about how I see you in this and I see you in that. And I've started to interview people that do the blogs. And so for your kids, if this is parents watching, it's a 9-minute interview with Katie. So if they won't read 1,000 words, maybe they'll.
It's like a podcast, right?
Yeah. It's a 9-minute podcast. Yeah. So my closing thought, I think, is, you know, I really truly believe we've been given an opportunity in this time. I feel like there's been this like pause button hit on our world right now. And if you're a parent, especially, I mean, period, any parent, but like especially maybe a parent that already has a kid in college, like you of all people would know, these years fly, they fly. And we've been given this little precious pause gift, I think, to be together and to enjoy one another, and maybe say some of the things that we haven't said, or listen in a way that we haven't really been listening. And I mean, you and I say this all the time, but I really believe, I mean, if you've got somebody on the call tonight, these families and these kids are going to be just fine no matter where they end up. And so I think it is not so much where you end up, but how you end up, and how you end up there as a family. So, you know, I'm just hopeful that's what people would take away.
Thanks, Rick. That's you're spot on. Really appreciate it. So I'm just going to end with just kind of a plug for next week, for next Monday night at 8. The head of school, Mary Carter, and Dean of Academic Programs, Lily Schutz, are going to be co-hosting the Fireside Chat, and they'll be discussing kind of the value of online learning as a new and exciting element of Derryfield's program and the Derryfield experience. They're also going to be sharing feedback from the surveys that have been given to parents and students and faculty, sharing some updates on any modifications to the schedule and program that need to be shared. So look for that invitation, Derryfield families, and send your questions to Lindley Schutz and Mary Carter. And thanks so much for joining us, Rick. Thank you for being such a great friend of the school, and for your wisdom and all the great leadership you do in this field.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Yep.
All right. Good night.